The sun was shining brightly over the bustling streets of Chicago. It was one of those perfect afternoons where the sky was clear and a gentle breeze made everything feel just right. People were out and about, enjoying the warmth and the lively energy of the city. Shops were open, cafes were busy, and cars moved slowly along the roads as pedestrians crossed at every corner. Among the crowd was Margaret, a sweet old woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Her silver hair shimmered under the sunlight, and her kind eyes sparkled with joy. She always carried herself with grace, even though her steps were slower now than they used to be. Today, she was on her way home from her favorite bakery, holding a small paper bag filled with warm, freshly baked bread. The smell of the bread wafted up to her nose, making her smile softly. She loved little moments like these, simple, peaceful, and full of life. Margaret paused at the edge of the crosswalk, waiting for the signal to turn green so she could cross the street. Around her, others stood patiently too, chatting quietly or scrolling through their phones. A young couple held hands nearby while a businessman tapped his foot impatiently, glancing at his watch. Everything seemed normal, ordinary even. No one could have guessed that something extraordinary was about to happen. On the other side of the intersection, Jake sat astride his loud, roaring motorcycle. His leather jacket was covered in patches, and his arms were decorated with bold tattoos that told stories of his wild past. He wasn't a bad guy necessarily, but he had a short temper and little patience for things that didn't go his way. Today he was running late, and the traffic was driving him crazy. Every second felt like an eternity, and the sight of Margaret, shuffling slowly across the street, only added fuel to his frustration. Jake revved the engine of his bike again, the sound cutting through the air like a growl. Some people turned to look at him, but most ignored it, used to the noise of the city. Margaret, however, flinched slightly at the sudden noise behind her. She glanced back briefly, seeing Jake sitting there, his scowl deepening with each passing moment. She gave him a polite nod, hoping it might ease the tension, but Jake didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. The light finally changed, and the crowd began to move forward. Margaret took a step, then another, clutching her bag of bread tightly. She walked carefully, mindful of the cracks in the pavement and the uneven surface beneath her feet. Though her pace was slow, she was determined to get across safely. After all, this was her neighborhood, and she knew these streets better than anyone. But Jake wasn't willing to wait. As Margaret moved ahead, he muttered under his breath, "Come on, hurry up." His fingers tightened around the handlebars of his bike, his knuckles turning white. He leaned forward, ready to speed off the moment there was enough space. To him, Margaret was just another obstacle standing between him and wherever he needed to be. He didn't see her as a person, with feelings, memories, and a lifetime of experiences. All he saw was someone slowing him down. Nearby, at a cozy, outdoor cafe, two men sat at a table, sipping coffee and talking animatedly. One of them was Dwayne, a towering figure with broad shoulders and a charismatic smile. Known to millions as The Rock, he was taking a rare day off from his hectic schedule. Across from him sat John, another well-known face, famous for his time in wrestling and acting. Both men were larger-than-life personalities, yet here they were, blending into the background of everyday life. They had been discussing their upcoming movie project, laughing about the challenges of working together again after so many years. But as they talked, their attention drifted toward the scene unfolding across the street. Dwayne's sharp eyes caught sight of Jake's aggressive posture and Margaret's cautious movements. Something about the situation felt off. Though neither man said anything at first, they simply watched, curious to see how it would play out. Back on the street, Jake's irritation reached its boiling point. He couldn't understand why everyone had to move so slowly. Didn't they realize he had places to be? With a huff, he decided he'd had enough. As Margaret took another deliberate step forward, Jake swung his leg over the seat of his motorcycle and dismounted. Without hesitation, he marched up behind her and shoved her roughly, muttering, "Get out of the way, Grandma." For a split second, time seemed to stop. Margaret stumbled, her balance lost completely. The bag of bread slipped from her grasp, landing on the ground with a soft thud. Her eyes widened in shock as she teetered precariously, her body tilting dangerously toward the middle of the street. In that same instant, a car approached, its tires squealing as the driver slammed on the brakes. The crowd froze, watching in horror as Margaret fell backward, landing inches away from the vehicle's front bumper. Screams erupted from the bystanders, and phones were whipped out to record the chaos. Some people rushed forward, unsure of what to do, while others simply stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. At the cafe, Dwayne and John exchanged a glance. Neither needed to say a word. They both knew exactly what had to be done. Within seconds, they were on their feet, moving swiftly toward the scene. Their presence commanded attention, and the crowd parted instinctively to let them through. For now, all eyes were on Margaret, lying helplessly in the street, and Jake, who stood nearby looking smug and unrepentant. Though the drama was far from over, one thing was certain. This quiet afternoon in Chicago was about to become unforgettable. Little did anyone know the actions of a reckless biker were about to bring together two unlikely heroes and change lives forever. The moment Margaret fell backward into the street, everything seemed to slow down. The car's tires screeched as the driver hit the brakes, but it was clear that stopping in time would be impossible. Panic rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Some gasped, others screamed, and a few even turned away, unable to watch what might happen next. Margaret lay there, dazed and frightened, her frail body dangerously close to the vehicle's front bumper. Jake, the biker who had shoved her, stood frozen for a split second, his face pale. For a brief moment, he looked shocked at what he had done, but that expression quickly faded. Instead of rushing to help or showing any sign of remorse, he crossed his arms and muttered under his breath. She should have moved faster. His tone was cold, almost dismissive, as if this entire situation was someone else's problem. But not everyone reacted the same way. Dwayne and John, who had been sitting at the cafe just moments earlier, sprang into action without hesitation. They both saw the gravity of the situation immediately and knew they couldn't stand by and do nothing. Dwayne, with his towering frame and commanding presence, reached Margaret first. He knelt down beside her, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, are you okay? Don't move yet," he said, placing a protective hand near her shoulder to keep her steady. Margaret blinked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. She tried to speak, but no words came out, only a soft whimper. Her hands trembled as she clutched at her chest, overwhelmed by the shock of the fall. Dwayne gently reassured her, saying, "It's going to be all right, we're here to help." With careful precision, he scooped her up into his strong arms, lifting her effortlessly off the ground. The crowd parted again as he carried her to safety, setting her down gently on the sidewalk away from the traffic. Meanwhile, John approached Jake, his jaw tight with anger. Though he kept his voice level, there was no mistaking the intensity behind his words. "What's wrong with you?" he demanded, stepping directly into Jake's path. Jake sneered, clearly unimpressed by the sudden confrontation. "Who are you supposed to be?" He shot back, his tone mocking. "Her babysitter?" John didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his imposing figure making Jake shift uncomfortably. "No," John finally said, his voice low and deliberate. "But I'm about to teach you a lesson you won't forget." There was a flicker of uncertainty in Jake's eyes now, though he tried to mask it with bravado. He glanced around, noticing, for the first time, how many people were watching and recording the scene on their phones. Dwayne joined them shortly after, ensuring Margaret was safe. When he stepped up beside John, the two men formed an undeniable wall of strength and authority. Together they radiated a sense of justice that made even the toughest individuals think twice. Jake suddenly seemed much smaller, his earlier confidence wavering under their combined glare. "You don't mess with innocent people," Dwayne said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Jake tried to laugh it off, brushing imaginary dust off his leather jacket. "Yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" he challenged, though his voice lacked conviction. Before he could react further, Dwayne grabbed him by the collar, lifting him clean off the ground. Jake kicked and squirmed, But there was no escaping Dwayne's iron grip. The crowd erupted in cheers, some people clapping while others shouted encouragement. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been waiting for someone to put Jake in his place. John stepped forward, pointing a finger at Jake's face. "Listen carefully," he said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "If we ever see you acting like this again, you'll have more than just us to deal with. Got it?" Jake nodded quickly, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such power or such moral clarity. For once, his usual tough guy act failed him completely. As Dwayne lowered Jake back to the ground, the biker stumbled backward, putting as much distance between himself and the two men as possible. He mumbled something unintelligible before turning to walk away, but he didn't get far. By now, several bystanders had called the police, and within minutes the sound of sirens filled the air. Officers arrived on the scene, quickly taking control of the situation. They handcuffed Jake and placed him in the back of a squad car, where he sat slumped, staring blankly ahead. With Jake subdued, Dwayne and John turned their attention back to Margaret. She was still sitting on the sidewalk, visibly shaken but otherwise unharmed. A paramedic knelt beside her, checking her vitals and asking gentle questions to assess her condition. Margaret managed a weak smile when she saw Dwayne and John approaching. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Tears welled up in her eyes as she added, "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Dwayne crouched down to her level, offering her a reassuring smile. "We couldn't just sit there and let something bad happen," he said softly. "You're safe now, and that's all that matters." John nodded in agreement, adding, "People like him shouldn't get away with treating others badly. Not today, not ever." The crowd around them began to disperse slowly, though many lingered to express their gratitude to Dwayne and John. Some shook their hands, while others simply thanked them with heartfelt smiles. Even the paramedics expressed admiration for their quick thinking and bravery. Margaret listened quietly as the commotion died down, clutching her bag of bread tightly in her lap. Despite everything that had happened, she felt a strange sense of relief knowing that good people still existed in the world. As the authorities finished documenting the incident, Dwayne and John stayed close to Margaret, ensuring she was truly okay. They asked her if she needed anything, a ride home, a call to family, or perhaps just someone to talk to. Margaret appreciated their kindness, but assured them she would be fine. "I live just a few blocks away," she explained. "My son will come pick me up once he hears about this, but thank you for everything." Though the immediate danger had passed, the impact of the day's events lingered in the air. What had started as an ordinary afternoon had turned into something extraordinary, a moment where strangers became heroes and justice prevailed in the most unexpected way. As Dwayne and John prepared to leave, they exchanged a knowing look, silently acknowledging the significance of what had just transpired. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. The story of Margaret, Jake, and the two unlikely heroes would soon spread far beyond the streets of Chicago, inspiring countless others along the way. For now, however, they focused on the present, grateful for the chance to make a difference, one small act of courage at a time. The afternoon sun continued to shine brightly over the city, but the mood on the street had shifted dramatically. What had started as a peaceful day had turned into a whirlwind of chaos and heroism. Margaret sat on the sidewalk, her hands trembling, as she tried to process everything that had just happened. Though she was physically unharmed, her mind raced with thoughts of what could have been. She glanced up at Dwayne and John, who stood nearby, making sure she was truly okay. Their presence was comforting, like a shield against the lingering fear in her heart. Dwayne crouched down again, his large frame casting a shadow over her. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked gently, his voice full of concern. Margaret nodded slowly, though her eyes still glistened with tears. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm just shaken. I've never had anything like this happen before." Her words trailed off as she looked down at her hands which were gripping the bag of bread tightly. The bread itself was slightly crushed now, but it didn't matter to her. She was alive, and for that, she felt incredibly grateful. John knelt beside her too, offering a warm smile. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his tone encouraging. "What happened wasn't your fault. Don't let it weigh on you too much." Margaret looked at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "Both of you. If it weren't for you." She couldn't finish the sentence, but the gratitude in her eyes said it all. Dwayne and John exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that they'd done what anyone should do: step in when someone needed help. As the paramedics finished their assessment, they confirmed that Margaret was physically fine, though they advised her to take it easy for the rest of the day. They offered to drive her home, but she politely declined. "My son will be here soon," she explained. "He works just a few blocks away. He'll come as soon as he hears about this." The paramedics nodded, packing up their equipment and stepping aside to let her rest. While Margaret waited for her son, Dwayne and John decided to stay with her. They pulled up chairs from a nearby cafe and sat beside her, keeping her company. The crowd of onlookers had mostly dispersed by now, though a few people lingered, still talking about the incident in hushed tones. Some approached Margaret to offer their support, while others simply thanked Dwayne and John for their bravery. It was clear that the two men had made a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed the scene. Margaret leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. For the first time since the accident, she began to feel a sense of calm. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins earlier was starting to fade, leaving behind a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I still can't believe it," she murmured, shaking her head. "That man, why would he do something like that?" Dwayne frowned, his expression thoughtful. "Some people don't think about the consequences of their actions," he said. "They only see what's in front of them, not how it affects others." John nodded in agreement. "But there are also good people out there," he added, gesturing to himself and Dwayne, "and will always step up when it matters." Margaret smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of hope. "It's strange," she said after a moment. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years and I've always felt safe here, but today, it makes me realize how quickly things can change." Her voice carried a hint of sadness, but there was also a quiet strength in her words. She had faced danger and come out the other side, thanks in large part to the kindness of strangers. As they talked, Margaret began to open up more, sharing stories about her life in the city. She told them about her late husband, who had passed away a few years ago, and her son, who worked tirelessly to provide for their family. She spoke fondly of her daily routine, visiting the bakery, tending to her garden, and chatting with neighbors. Her life was simple, but it was filled with love and purpose. Dwayne and John listened intently, asking questions and laughing along with her stories. They found themselves drawn to her warmth and resilience, qualities that shone brightly despite the trauma she had just endured. Meanwhile, Jake sat quietly in the back of the police car, his head bowed. The reality of his actions was finally sinking in, though he struggled to fully comprehend the weight of what he had done. He replayed the events in his mind: the shove, the fall, the horrified screams of the crowd. He hadn't meant for things to go so far, but his impatience and anger had gotten the better of him. Now, as he sat handcuffed and surrounded by officers, he realized there was no escaping the consequences of his behavior. The officers took turns questioning him, jotting down notes as they pieced together the story. Witnesses came forward, recounting what they had seen and providing video footage from their phones. The evidence was overwhelming, and Jake knew there was no way to talk his way out of trouble this time. Still, he tried to defend himself, claiming that he didn't mean any harm and that Margaret should have moved faster. His excuses fell flat, met with stern looks from the officers and disapproving glares from the crowd. Back on the sidewalk, Margaret's son arrived, rushing toward her with a look of panic on his face. "Mom!" he called out, his voice filled with worry. He dropped to his knees beside her, wrapping her in a tight hug. "Are you okay? What happened?" he asked. his eyes scanning her for injuries. Margaret patted his arm reassuringly. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said. "Just a little shaken up, but these two gentlemen saved me." She gestured to Dwayne and John, who stood nearby, watching the reunion with smiles on their faces. The son turned to them, his expression softening, with gratitude. "Thank you," he said earnestly, extending his hand. "I don't know how to repay you for what you did." Dwayne shook his hand firmly, replying, "There's no need for repayment, we're just glad we could help." John nodded in agreement, adding, "Take care of your mom. That's all the thanks we need." After a few more minutes of conversation, Margaret and her son prepared to leave. She hugged Dwayne and John one last time, thanking them again for their kindness and bravery. As they walked away, she turned back briefly, waving goodbye with a smile. Dwayne and John waved back, watching as the pair disappeared down the street. Though the encounter had been brief, it left a lasting impression on all of them. With Margaret, safe and on her way home, Dwayne and John returned to the cafe where they had been sitting earlier. The table was still there, untouched, with their half-empty coffee cups waiting patiently. They sat down, both feeling a mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and a touch of exhaustion. The adrenaline from earlier had worn off, leaving them drained but content. "Well," John said, breaking the silence, "that was eventful." Dwayne chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You can say that again. I didn't expect our coffee break to turn into a rescue mission." They both laughed, the sound light and genuine. For a moment, they allowed themselves to relax, enjoying the simplicity of the moment. As they sipped their lukewarm coffee, they reflected on the day's events. They talked about Margaret's courage, Jake's recklessness, and the power of stepping in when it mattered most. "You know," Dwayne said thoughtfully, "people always say they'd do the right thing if they were in a situation like that. But when it actually happens, it's not always so easy." John nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, it's easy to sit back and watch, but taking action, that's what makes the difference." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics as the afternoon wore on. They joked about how their movie project might include a scene inspired by today's events, imagining the chaos and heroics playing out on the big screen. Despite the seriousness of what had happened, they found humor in the absurdity of it all. After all, life had a way of surprising them, even when they thought they'd seen it all. By the time they left the cafe, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. The streets were quieter now, the earlier commotion reduced to whispers among neighbors. Dwayne and John walked side by side, their footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. They didn't speak much, each lost in their own thoughts, but the bond between them had grown stronger after the day's events. Though the afternoon had been unexpected and intense, it reminded them of something important. Even in a world that often felt chaotic and divided, small acts of kindness and courage could make a big difference, and sometimes those moments brought people together in ways they never anticipated. As they parted ways for the evening, they shared a final fist bump, silently acknowledging the unspoken connection they had forged. For Dwayne and John, the day was proof that being a hero wasn't about wearing a cape or having superpowers. It was about showing up when it mattered most. And for Margaret, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were still good people willing to step forward and light the way. The evening settled over Chicago, casting long shadows across the streets. The golden hues of sunset gave way to a soft purple twilight, and the city began its nightly transformation. Streetlights flickered on, illuminating sidewalks where people hurried home or gathered at restaurants and cafes. Life moved forward, but the events of the afternoon lingered in the air like an unspoken promise, a reminder that even in chaos, humanity could shine through. Dwayne and John walked together for a while, their footsteps steady and unhurried. Neither man felt the need to rush. They were content to let the quiet moments stretch between them. After everything that had happened, silence felt natural, almost comforting. It was as if the weight of the day had bonded them in a way words couldn't fully capture. Still, there was more to discuss, more to reflect on, and both men knew it. Do you think she'll be okay? John asked finally, breaking the calm. His voice was low, thoughtful, carrying just a hint of concern. He didn't need to clarify who she was. Margaret's face was etched in their minds, her frail figure and kind eyes unforgettable. Dwayne nodded slowly, his gaze fixed ahead. Yeah, he said after a moment. She seemed strong, tougher than most people give her credit for. There was admiration in his tone, a respect for the resilience Margaret had shown despite the fear and shock. John tilted his head slightly, considering this. Still, I can't imagine how scary that must have been for her, he said. 1 second she's crossing the street like any other day, and the next, well, you saw what happened. Dwayne exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing. That's true, he agreed. But she got through it. And she had people around her who cared. Her son, the paramedics, us. That makes a difference. They paused, at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Cars streamed past, their headlights glowing brightly against the darkening sky. For a moment, neither man spoke, each lost in his own thoughts. The image of Jake's angry face flashed briefly in Dwayne's mind, the sneer, the arrogance, the lack of remorse. He shook his head slightly, dispelling the memory. What about him? John asked suddenly, as if reading Dwayne's thoughts. Do you think he'll learn anything from this? Dwayne frowned, his expression hardening. I don't know, he admitted. Some people never do. They make mistakes, get caught, and then go right back to doing the same thing once they're free again. He glanced at John, adding, but maybe this will stick with him. Maybe seeing us step in and seeing everyone watching will make him realize he can't act like that without consequences. John nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Let's hope so, he said, because if he doesn't learn, someone else might not be as lucky as Margaret. The thought hung heavy between them, unspoken but understood. Not everyone had heroes nearby when trouble struck. Not everyone survived close calls with reckless individuals like Jake. As they crossed the street, the conversation shifted. They talked about the crowd, the bystanders who had recorded the incident, cheered when justice was served, and offered support to Margaret. Some had approached Dwayne and John afterward, thanking them profusely, while others simply nodded in acknowledgement. It was clear that the community had rallied around the moment, united by a shared sense of right and wrong. It's funny, Dwayne said, a small smile tugging at his lips. People always say they'd step in if something bad happened. But when it actually does, they freeze up. They don't know what to do. John chuckled softly. Yeah, we've all been guilty of that at some point, he admitted. Standing there thinking someone else will handle it, but today we didn't hesitate. No, we didn't, Dwayne agreed, his smile widening. And I'm glad we didn't. Because if we had waited, who knows what might have happened. They both fell silent for a moment, reflecting on the randomness of it all. If they hadn't chosen that particular cafe, if they hadn't noticed Margaret and Jake at the intersection, if they hadn't acted quickly enough, the possibilities stretched out endlessly, each one darker than the last. By the time they reached the corner where they usually parted ways, the city buzzed with nighttime energy. Lights twinkled from shop windows, music drifted from nearby bars, and laughter echoed down alleyways. Despite the earlier tension, life continued as usual. Dwayne stopped walking, turning to face John. You heading home? He asked casually, though his tone carried a trace of reluctance. He enjoyed these conversations, these moments of connection that reminded him why he did what he did, not just as an actor or wrestler, but as a person. Yeah, John replied, glancing at his watch. Long day tomorrow. Got to prep for that scene we talked about earlier. He grinned, the playful spark returning to his eyes. Maybe I'll suggest adding a little action sequence inspired by today. Dwayne laughed, shaking his head. Don't push it, man. One rescue mission is enough for now. Their laughter faded into another comfortable silence, the kind only close friends could share. Before parting, Dwayne placed a hand on John's shoulder. Thanks for having my back out there, he said sincerely. We make a good team. John smiled, patting Dwayne's arm. Always, anytime. With that, they went their separate ways, disappearing into the night like two ordinary men blending into the fabric of the city. Yet for those who had witnessed their actions earlier, they would forever remain extraordinary. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her cozy living room, wrapped in a soft blanket and sipping a cup of tea. Her son, Daniel, hovered nearby, fussing over her like a protective bird. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked for the 100th time, his brow furrowed with worry. Margaret chuckled softly, reaching out to pat his hand. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm fine. Really." She took another sip of tea, letting the warmth spread through her chest. "Just tired?" Daniel sighed, sinking into the chair beside her. "I still can't believe that guy pushed you," he muttered, his voice tinged with anger. "Who does something like that? Doesn't he have any decency?" Margaret shrugged slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe not," she said gently. "But it's not worth dwelling on. What matters is that I'm safe, thanks to those two men." Her words brought a flicker of gratitude to Daniel's eyes. "I wish I could thank them again," he said earnestly. "Properly, I mean. Not just a handshake and a quick thank you. They saved your life." Margaret nodded, her gaze distant. "So many good people in the world," she murmured. "Even when things seem dark, there's always light somewhere." Outside, the neighborhood hummed with activity. Neighbors strolled by, some stopping to check on Margaret and Daniel. Word of the afternoon's events had spread quickly, and offers of help poured in, from meals to company to simple reassurances that Margaret wasn't alone. She accepted it all graciously, touched by the outpouring of kindness. It was moments like these that reminded her why she loved her community so much. Later that night, as Margaret lay in bed, she found herself replaying the day's events in her mind. The roar of the motorcycle, the shove, the screeching tires, all of it felt surreal, like a movie she had watched rather than lived. But the faces of Dwayne and John remained vivid, their voices clear in her memory. She closed her eyes, picturing their smiles, their strength, their determination. They had stepped in without hesitation, risking their own safety to protect hers. It was a selflessness she hoped to carry forward in her own life, no matter how small the gesture. Across town, Jake sat in a holding cell, staring blankly at the wall. The reality of his situation pressed heavily on him, though he struggled to process it fully. The officers had explained the charges: reckless endangerment, assault, and possibly more, but the legal jargon blurred together in his mind. He could focus on was the image of Dwayne lifting him off the ground, the crowd cheering, the cameras recording every second of his humiliation. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt truly powerless. His bravado had crumbled under the weight of accountability, leaving behind a raw vulnerability he wasn't prepared to face. He leaned back against the cold metal bench, closing his eyes. Images of Margaret falling, of the car skidding to a stop, of the horrified expressions on the bystanders' faces. They played on a loop in his mind, refusing to fade. A part of him wanted to dismiss it all, to convince himself it wasn't his fault. But deep down, he knew better. As the hours ticked by, Jake began to reflect. Not deeply, not profoundly, but enough to plant a seed of doubt in his own behavior. He thought about the choices he had made, the anger that had driven him to act without thinking. For years he had prided himself on being untouchable, on living life on his terms. But now, sitting in that cell, he realized how fragile that illusion was. One reckless decision had changed everything, not just for him but for Margaret, for the crowd, for Dwayne and John. He didn't have answers yet, and maybe he never would. But for the first time, he wondered if it was possible to do better. Back at the cafe where it all began, the chairs were stacked neatly on the tables, and the lights were dimmed for the night. The staff had cleaned up the remnants of Dwayne and John's coffee cups, unaware of the role the spot had played in the day's drama. Tomorrow the cafe would reopen, welcoming new customers and starting fresh. But for now it stood quiet, a silent witness to the extraordinary lives that had intersected within its walls. And so, as the city slept, the story of the biker, the old lady and the two unlikely heroes became a part of its history, A tale whispered among. The next morning, the city of Chicago woke up to a new day, the sun rising over the skyline and painting the streets with soft golden light. People went about their routines, heading to work, dropping kids off at school, or grabbing coffee from their favorite spots. But beneath the surface of this ordinary day, the events of the previous afternoon continued to ripple through the community. News outlets had picked up the story, sharing footage of the incident and interviews with witnesses. Social media buzzed, with reactions as people praised Dwayne and John for their bravery while condemning Jake's reckless behavior. Margaret started her day slowly, still feeling the lingering effects of the shock. She sat by the window in her kitchen, sipping tea and watching the world outside come alive. Her son, Daniel, had insisted she take it easy for the next few days, but Margaret wasn't one to sit idle for long. "I'll be fine," she told him when he checked on her before leaving for work. "Just need a little rest, that's all." Though she smiled reassuringly, there was a quiet sadness in her eyes, a reminder of how close she had come to tragedy. As the hours passed, Margaret found herself reflecting on the kindness she had encountered since the incident. Neighbors stopped by throughout the morning, bringing flowers, baked goods, and heartfelt words of support. Some shared stories of their own struggles, finding comfort in Margaret's resilience. Others simply sat with her, offering silent companionship. It was a reminder of how interconnected they all were, even in a big city like Chicago. Margaret felt grateful for these small acts of love, each one helping to mend the cracks left behind by fear and uncertainty. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find Dwayne and John standing on her porch, smiling warmly. They looked slightly out of place in their casual clothes, towering over the modest doorway, but their presence was anything but intimidating. "We just wanted to check on you," Dwayne said gently, holding out a bouquet of fresh flowers. "See how you're doing?" Margaret's face lit up with surprise and delight. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed, stepping aside to let them in. "You didn't have to do this." She took the flowers, inhaling their sweet scent before placing them in a vase on the dining table. "Please come in. I was just making some tea. Would you like some?" Dwayne and John exchanged amused glances but accepted her offer. They settled into the cozy living room, marveling at the warmth and charm of Margaret's home. Photos lined the walls, capturing memories of family gatherings, vacations, and milestones. A handmade quilt draped over the back of the couch, its vibrant colors telling stories of patience and care. It was clear that Margaret poured her heart into every corner of her space. Over cups of steaming tea, they talked about everything and nothing. Margaret shared more about her life, the joys, the challenges, the lessons learned along the way. She spoke fondly of her late husband, describing him as her rock during difficult times. "He always said I was stronger than I thought," she said with a nostalgic smile. "And now here I am proving him right." Dwayne and John listened intently, asking questions and laughing at her anecdotes. They admired her spirit, her ability to find humor and grace even after such a harrowing experience. "You're an inspiration," John said sincerely. "Not everyone could handle something like that with so much dignity." Margaret waved off the compliment, blushing slightly. "Oh, stop it," she teased. "I'm just an old woman trying to live my life." But the conversation eventually turned to Jake. Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't hate him," she admitted. "I feel sorry for him, honestly. He must be carrying a lot of anger inside to act the way he did." Dwayne nodded thoughtfully. "That may be true," he said, "but anger isn't an excuse. What he did was wrong and he has to face the consequences." John agreed, adding, "Still, it's good that you can see past the anger. Not everyone would be able to do that." Margaret shrugged, her expression softening. "Holding on to bitterness won't change what happened," she said. "I'd rather focus on the good things, the people who helped me, the friends who've reached out, and the fact that I'm still here." Her words resonated deeply with Dwayne and John, who had spent years using their platforms to inspire others. They often talked about the importance of kindness, courage, and standing up for what was right. But hearing it from someone like Margaret made those values feel even more powerful. She embodied them without effort, living them out in her daily life. It was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Before leaving, Dwayne and John promised to stay in touch. "If you ever need anything," Dwayne said, handing her a piece of paper with his number written on it, "don't hesitate to call." Margaret tucked the note into her pocket, touched by their thoughtfulness. "Thank you," she said, hugging them both tightly, "for everything." Meanwhile, Jake's situation grew more complicated. The police had charged him with reckless endangerment and assault, and news of his arrest had spread quickly. Local reporters camped outside the station, eager to get a statement, while social media users debated whether justice would truly be served. Some argued that Jake deserved leniency, citing his youth and lack of prior offenses. Others demanded harsh punishment, pointing to the danger he had posed to Margaret and the public. Jake himself remained in custody, his initial bravado replaced by a mix of shame and frustration. He replayed the events in his mind over and over, trying to understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. At first, he tried to justify his actions, convincing himself that Margaret had been too slow, that anyone else would have done the same. But the memory of Dwayne lifting him off the ground and the crowd cheering in approval kept resurfacing, forcing him to confront the truth. During a visit from his sister, Lisa, Jake finally broke down. "I messed up," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean for it to go that far, I just lost it." Lisa listened quietly, her expression a mix of disappointment and concern. "You scared a lot of people, Jake," she said firmly. "Not just Margaret, but everyone who saw what happened. Do you realize how lucky you are that she's okay?" Jake nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know," he whispered. "I keep thinking about it. The car, the crowd, those guys stepping in. What if something worse had happened? What if she hadn't been okay?" He buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by guilt. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his actions, not just the legal repercussions, but the emotional toll on those around him. Lisa placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late to make things right," she said softly. "Apologize. Show people you're willing to change. That's the only way you'll move forward." Jake looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen. "Do you think they'll believe me?" he asked hesitantly. Lisa sighed. "It won't be easy," she admitted, "but it's a start." Back in Margaret's neighborhood, the sense of unity sparked by the incident continued to grow. Residents organized a small gathering at the local park, inviting Margaret and her family to join them. There were speeches, songs, and plenty of laughter, all celebrating the strength of their community. Someone even set up a makeshift stage, where children performed skits inspired by the heroes of the day, Dwayne and John. Margaret watched it, all unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. She never imagined her near tragedy would bring so many people together, turning strangers into allies. As fireworks lit up the night sky, she stood beside Daniel, holding his hand tightly. "This
is why we stay," she said quietly, "because no matter what happens, we have each other."
In the distance, Dwayne and John stood side by side, observing the celebration with smiles on their faces. They had planned to leave earlier, but something about the evening compelled them to stay. Maybe it was the joy radiating from the crowd, or maybe it was the knowledge that their actions had sparked something meaningful. Either way, they felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a reminder that even small acts of courage could create ripples far beyond what they imagined. As the night drew to a close, Margaret approached them once more, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you again," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "For saving me, for inspiring everyone here, for being who you are." Dwayne and John exchanged a glance, then hugged her simultaneously. "We're just glad we could help," Dwayne replied. "And remember, you're the real hero tonight." With that, they parted ways, each returning to their respective lives. But the bond they had formed would remain, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and connection. And though the city of Chicago moved on, the story of the biker, the old lady, and the two unlikely heroes became a lasting reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. The days that followed the incident felt like a turning point for everyone involved. Life in Chicago carried on as usual, with its bustling streets and busy routines, but the ripple effects of what had happened continued to shape the lives of those at the center of the story. Margaret, Dwayne, John, and even Jake found themselves reflecting on the choices they had made and the paths they were now walking. For Margaret, the aftermath was filled with moments of gratitude and quiet reflection. She returned to her daily routine slowly, taking short walks around the neighborhood and tending to her garden. Her hands moved carefully among the flowers, pulling weeds and trimming leaves, as if reconnecting with the simple joys of life. Yet she couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. Strangers greeted her warmly when she passed by, often stopping to thank her for her strength or simply to share a kind word. It was as though the entire community had rallied around her, offering support and admiration. Margaret's son Daniel remained protective, insisting on driving her wherever she needed to go. "Just until you feel completely comfortable again," he would say, though Margaret knew it was more for his peace of mind than hers. She appreciated his concern but also wanted to prove to herself and to him that she was still capable of independence. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret turned to Daniel with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she began, "I've been thinking about forgiveness." Daniel raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden topic. "Forgiveness?" he repeated. "For that guy who pushed you?" Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yes," she said softly. "It's not easy, but I don't want to carry anger or resentment. It doesn't serve me or anyone else." Daniel hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He admired his mother's ability to see the good in people, even after they had caused harm, but he wasn't sure he could be so forgiving. Still, he respected her decision, knowing it came from a place of wisdom and grace. Jake's journey, on the other hand, was far more complicated. After spending several nights in jail, he appeared before a judge who set bail under strict conditions. The charges against him were serious: reckless endangerment, assault, and public endangerment. But Jake's lawyer argued that his lack of prior offenses and willingness to take responsibility might work in his favor. For once, Jake didn't resist. He sat quietly during the proceedings, listening as the judge outlined the consequences of his actions. When asked if he had anything to say, Jake stood up, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, looking directly at Margaret, who had chosen to attend the hearing. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I hope one day you can forgive me." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his apology hanging in the air. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him with a calm, steady gaze. Finally, she nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without committing to forgiveness. It was enough, for now. As Jake left the courthouse later that day, surrounded by reporters and cameras, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. Over the following weeks, Jake began attending counseling sessions, encouraged by his sister Lisa. At first, he resisted, feeling defensive and frustrated. But as he opened up about his struggles, his anger, his insecurities, his fear of failure, he started to understand why he had acted the way he did. His counselor helped him develop healthier ways to manage his emotions, teaching him techniques to stay calm in stressful situations. Slowly but surely, Jake began to change. He avoided riding his motorcycle recklessly, apologized to others he had wronged in the past, and even volunteered at a local shelter, hoping to make amends in some small way. Though many in the community remained skeptical of his transformation, others were willing to give him a chance. Margaret, for her part, kept her distance but occasionally sent encouraging notes through Lisa. "He has a long way to go," she told Daniel one evening, "but I believe everyone deserves a second chance, if they're truly willing to earn it." Dwayne and John, meanwhile, found themselves reflecting on their roles in the incident. They hadn't set out to be heroes that day. They were simply two men enjoying coffee and conversation when fate intervened. Yet the experience had reminded them of the importance of stepping up when it mattered most. In interviews and appearances, they spoke openly about the power of kindness and courage, urging others to look out for one another. "We're all connected," Dwayne said during one talk show appearance. "When someone needs help, we have a responsibility to act. You don't have to be extraordinary to make a difference, you just have to care." Their message resonated deeply, inspiring countless viewers to share their own stories of heroism and compassion. Social media lit up with hashtags like #be the hero and everyday courage as people celebrated acts of bravery both big and small. Dwayne and John became symbols of hope, proof that ordinary individuals could create extraordinary change. Despite their newfound fame, they remained grounded, staying in touch with Margaret and checking in on her regularly. They visited her home, several times bringing laughter and warmth into her living room. On one such visit, Margaret surprised them with a gift, a framed photo of the three of them taken at the park celebration. "To remind you," she said with a twinkle in her eye, "that heroes come in all shapes and sizes." Dwayne and John accepted the gift with heartfelt thanks, promising to treasure it always. As the weeks turned into months, the bonds forged during that fateful afternoon only grew stronger. Margaret became a beloved figure in her community, known not just for her resilience but for her unwavering belief in the goodness of people. Dwayne and John continued to use their platforms to spread messages of hope and unity, drawing inspiration from Margaret's example. And Jake, though still working to rebuild trust, took steps toward becoming a better version of himself. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret decided to visit the spot where the incident had occurred. She walked slowly, her cane tapping against the pavement until she reached the crosswalk. Standing there, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the memories wash over her. It had been a terrifying moment, yes, but it had also been a turning point, a reminder that life was precious and fragile yet full of possibilities. Opening her eyes, Margaret smiled softly. The street was alive with activity, children laughing, dogs barking, and cars moving steadily along. Everything seemed normal, yet somehow brighter. She glanced down at the photo in her hand, the one of her, Dwayne, and John, and felt a surge of gratitude. That day had brought challenges, yes, but it had also brought connection, courage, and a renewed sense of purpose. Turning back toward home, Margaret walked with a lighter step, her heart full of hope. Life wasn't perfect, and neither were the people in it, but that was okay, because even in imperfection there was beauty, in the kindness of strangers, in the strength of community, and in the simple act of choosing to move forward, one step at a time.